All right, hey guys, welcome to this series from the Foil Project, which is going to talk through everything about how to learn to downwind. So this is going to be the first one of, I think, a series of 5 videos. And today we're going to walk through gear and like all your equipment, getting that set up right. And then we're going to move on to getting your paddle technique correct and being able to paddle in a straight line. So this is for the people who are completely brand new to downwind foiling. You might have come from surfing, you might have come from wing foiling or any other water sport, and you're trying to get into downwind foiling. We just want to make it as easy as possible. So first thing to talk about is the gear, and probably the most important thing is the foil. So if you're an absolute noob and you're around that 80 to 90 kilogram mark, you can't go past just getting basically the biggest foil you possibly can. So from the code range, that would be the 1540. So if you're starting out and you're in that heavier weight range, it's a bit of a no-brainer. You just go for something as big as possible to generate as much lift as you possibly can. As a note though, I would recommend for lighter riders, sometimes getting the biggest foil is not the best option because you'll end up having a lot of drag under the water. So if you're around that like 60 to 70 kilogram mark, consider going something just a little bit smaller. So the step down would be the 1300, or if you're really light, maybe even the 1130. And that would be beneficial because you get a little bit less drag underwater, so you can paddle slightly faster. Another option is like this R series wing. So this is the 1075. Obviously not quite as big, but if you were light and getting into the sport, it's another option which has got a little bit less drag than something that's a lower aspect like that. Quickly touch on some other components of the foil. So we've talked about the front wing already, but we need to talk about the fuselage, the tail wing and the mast. So for the mast, we nearly always recommend a 75 centimeter mast. I'll grab this one here. And the reason for this for a beginner is because it's the good length that you're not going to breach immediately when you get out of the water. So anything shorter tends to mean that the foil is riding really close to the surface, you're likely to breach. But it's short enough that it doesn't create much drag. The longer your mast goes, the more drag it has. And so when you're trying to paddle up, you'll be slightly slower because you've got that longer mast. For me personally, I've been loving riding an 80 centimeter mast. My logic for that is I find it turns a little bit better once I'm up on foil. But if you're just learning, I'd 100% just recommend going 75. It's also one of those things which is a little bit of a no-brainer in my opinion. You just get recommended 75, you go with it, and then down the track, if you feel like you want something longer to do turns or just so that you're breaching a little bit less, that is a personal decision which you can make. All right, then on to fuselage. So got 2 different ones just here. This is actually the extra small fuselage, and then the small fuselage here. So probably not the best examples for what I would recommend. Small fuses generally mean you have a slightly faster pumping cadence, and also you lose a little bit of pitch stability, particularly if you're learning. So for most people getting into the sport, I'd go for the medium fuselage, just because it gives a slightly faster pumping cadence, which can help with the paddle up technique, compared to something like the long fuselage. And also it's kind of like the middle ground, which works for basically everyone. If you're a bigger guy and you feel like you're gonna have a slower pumping cadence or you're worried about stability, the large fuselage is probably gonna be the best option for you. And then final thing is tail wing. So on this wing here, we've got the 150, which is basically the middle range for the code setup. I would opt for something slightly bigger than this when you're learning. It's the same for any other brand. Don't go for their smaller tail wings as you're learning to paddle up. Something bigger is going to give you a little bit more lift and projection once you're up on foil. So trying to get something that's not too small will definitely help you. It'll also make sure that when you pump, you're getting that push off the back of your tail, which is pretty necessary for getting up and going. We'll move on to board choice. So my normal recommendation from working at the shop and seeing people try different boards has been going about at least 20 kilograms more than your body weight. And I wouldn't go any more than 40 kilograms more than your body weight. The reasons for these are, so if your board's too lower volume, you'll obviously be sinking and it'll be very difficult. But if you go too high, you end up getting this really corky motion when you're out in the ocean, and it actually makes it more difficult to stand on your board once you're in the bumps. So my recommendation is 20 to 40 kilograms above your body weight. The choice on how high you go probably depends on how confident you are with balance. So if you've done a supping background or you've done plenty of winging before, you might be okay going for something that's a little bit smaller. But if you have come completely in and you have no experience, going something larger will allow you to get a bit more balance, and that's probably going to accelerate how quickly you learn. Next thing to talk about is the width. And this is probably the most important thing, because a lot of people are tempted to go quite wide to gain that stability. But when you go wide, you create a lot of drag. And so you don't want to go too wide. I would never recommend going over 21 inches wide on your board. So the width across the board, no wider than 21. So if you feel like you're not getting enough stability with something like that, you probably can just get the board a lot longer. And the longer board is going to give you that stability as well, while keeping the width not too wide. So I reckon the golden number for someone getting into the sport is going to be 20 inches. And if you're a little bit more confident, I'd go for something like 19, potentially even 18 if you feel like you've got that good stability. And then the third and final thing I would pick is the length. So around the 8-foot mark seems to be where most people land, but the length of the board really depends on the conditions that you're planning to go out in. So if you're going to go out in really short stacked bumps, you probably don't need a board that's quite as long. But if you're planning to go out in really long open ocean swells like they get in Hawaii or in other like oceans around the world, you might want something that's quite a bit longer. So for here in Perth, anything around 8 foot is going to be completely fine. I wouldn't go too long. Something around 9 foot is probably getting to the stage where it's going to be a bit tricky to get that pumping motion going, particularly if you're getting into the sport. So I think 8 to 9, and then if you're a lighter rider or you're doing it in really stacked bumps, you can probably get away with going down to around 7 foot. And then obviously you got to balance all those three things. It's a bit of a personal choice. So if you're not entirely sure, feel free to reach out or feel free to ask another mate who has got into downwind foiling, and they'll be able to direct you in the right place. All right, the third and final piece of equipment is the paddle. So for me, I've always had my paddle practically at my head height. And if you have no idea how you like your paddle, that's the easiest thing to do. Just get it and cut it to head height and you're set to go. I've seen people like it from about their eyes to around an inch over their head. So if you're finding that your shoulders are getting really sore, particularly this upper shoulder, it often means that your paddle is a little bit too long, because it'll mean you're kind of getting into this position here, which is really hard on that shoulder. So I definitely recommend starting at your head height. Then probably for most people, it's going to be cutting it down slightly if you're not finding that good. Others prefer it slightly longer. It seems to be a little bit up to personal preference. So also with your paddle, we're just going to talk a bit about the paddle blade size. The most common size is by far the 85 square inches. This is what I have here. It's a great medium where it's not too big so that it's like really hard to pull the paddle through the water and slow down your cadence, but it's also big enough that you can generate a lot of power from it. There's a tendency for people to go to really big, large paddle heads, but if you're just getting into the sport and you haven't done much paddling before, you can find it can be really tough on a lot of the muscles around your shoulders. So I personally wouldn't recommend going much bigger than 85 unless you're like a really strong, confident paddler already coming from a SUP background. Lighter riders could go for something a bit smaller, just for the same reason. It'll help you keep the cadence up in your paddle and make sure that you're engaging the full paddle and doing proper technique instead of sloppy technique. So that's the most important thing, is having good technique, whether independent of what paddle size you're using. I know that Black Project have now a couple different sizes of paddle heads, so you can go crazy and choose that. Most other brands are normally releasing around an 85 centimeter one, and you'll see a lot which are quite a bit bigger, but I would refrain from going for something too big. As you're learning, it's not going to help you out. If anything, it might hinder your progress. So that's that with paddle heads. All right, that was take number 2 for the gear. I think we're good to go. All right, so the next thing to talk about, and probably the focus of this session, is paddling technique. So there's 3 key points I want you to keep in mind when doing this. Number 1 is entering the paddle as early as you can in front of you and exiting it as early as you possibly can. So your paddle should enter, if you're standing on the board, your paddle should enter all the way up. For me, it'd be in front of the nose of my board because it's quite a short board, but at least as close as you can to the front of the board as possible. And you're going to exit the paddle at your feet. We don't want to be pulling past here. All of this stroke just here feels like you're getting a lot of power, but what you're actually doing is pulling yourself down into the water and slowing down your cadence of your stroke. So that's the first thing we're going to focus on. Second thing is making sure that your paddle blade fully enters the water. So if I'm holding my hand here on the shaft, I want it to completely submerge basically my whole hand, so that we're going to make sure that the full blade enters and pulls through the water throughout the entire stroke. The third and final thing is to make sure that the shaft of the paddle is pointing upright vertical. So to do this, if I'm standing on the board, paddling along like this is going to spin me in a circle if I've got my paddle on an angle. To get it upright, I'm going to move this top hand across my body, and I'll keep that shaft of the paddle nice and vertical throughout the stroke. Often people are paddling along like this, wondering why am I turning in a circle? And the simplest way to fix that, we'll wait for the motorbikes. The simplest way to fix that is going to be to move your paddle and get it vertical by shifting that arm across your body. By having a relatively straight arm here as well, that will help you get a nice paddle stroke. All right, from there, let's talk about stance on our board. So I recommend you stand with your feet slightly wider than shoulder width. So if this is a shoulder width stance, we're gonna have the insides of our feet outside our shoulders like this. Our back foot is going to be perpendicular to the board, and the front foot is going to be on a 45-degree angle. This can vary slightly from person to person, so it's about playing around with it yourself and finding out what works best. I recommend having your feet lined down the center of the board. This means that when you're pumping, you'll have the board just going up and down like this, and you won't get any side-to-side rock. But I understand that a lot of people come from different backgrounds, and you might be more comfortable standing with your feet kind of side on the board. What I want to make sure that you have is that the heel of your foot must be at least down the center of the board, and the toes of your front foot must be at least down the center of the board. If you're off like this, that's not going to work when you pump, because you'll get too much rolling action. So your heel, you've got to have at least some part of your foot along the stringer, no matter how your stance is. So yeah, that's stance. And now we're going to talk through the paddle stroke and technique. So we're going to start by reaching forward, keeping that paddle shaft nice and vertical, getting as far in front of us on the board as possible, entering the paddle. We stab it into the water and submerge the full head. Then we're going to pull nice and strong through to our feet and release. Another little tip to focus on is if you have your paddle completely side onto the board as you pull through, that will generally start turning you to the left. So we'll notice that the main focus of today is being able to paddle in a straight line. If you're constantly turning to the left, that's going to be really hard to paddle up downwind. So we're going to make sure that the paddle head is facing slightly towards our board like this. So instead of having it square on through the stroke, you're going to twist it and just have the paddle blade slightly open like that. This normally can fix a lot of people's problems with turning around in a circle. Next thing to focus on is keeping the blade nice and close to the side of your board. So we don't want to be paddling out here. We want to be paddling with this blade nice and close to the edge of the board right here. The third and final thing we'll talk about is the J stroke. So this is basically starting out nice and wide, pulling through to the tip of your board, and then pulling down the side of your board. So it looks like a motion reaching out wide and far forward, pulling towards the tip, and then bringing it down and releasing at your feet. All right, we'll move on to the first drill. So first drill we're doing is sitting down on the board like this, and this is for a complete beginner, so you don't have to have any balance to do this drill, and we're going to focus on our paddle technique. So first thing I want you to do is put your hand just above the blade of the paddle and enter it into the water, and we want our blade to go all the way down to our hand. So when we pull through, we're going to enter like this, hand under water, pull through. So that, when we're standing upright, is the amount of depth we want to get on our paddle stroke. All right, now let's start the drill. So keeping our hand here, top hand somewhere up here, so about shoulder width apart or a bit wider, and we're going to enter out as far in front as possible, pull through, and exit at our knee. I don't want you pulling past your knee, just go straight to your knee. So let's practice that a couple of times. All right. So you'll immediately notice that as I do this, I'm gradually turning to the left. So the goal for this entire session is to learn how to paddle on just one side and go in a straight line or even turn to the right. So the first thing I'm going to do is just open my paddle head slightly towards my board. So this is square onto the board. I'm going to open it slightly like this. So imagine, here we go. You immediately can see, even from just doing this and still exiting in front of my knee, I'm now gradually turning to the right, which is really good. All right, so now next thing I'm going to do is what's called a J stroke. So I'll start out wide, bring it towards the tip of the board, and then bring it down to the side of the board. So leaning out wide, enter, side, down. Let's do that a couple of times. Sweet. So another thing I also want to mention while we're doing this is I'm keeping my paddle vertical, like this. I'm not doing this. So see, when it's side on, nothing really works. You've got to get your paddle up and vertical, out and across. All right, now we've got that sorted. We can paddle to the right. We can paddle to the left pretty easily. That's just doing normal paddle strokes. We can paddle to the right by doing our J stroke and by facing the board there. So now let's practice just paddling in a dead straight line. All right, once you've got this set, you're ready to move to your knees. The first thing we do is just gently get to your knees. Easiest way I find is by tucking the feet over the back, and you can lift yourself up to the knees like this. All right, so now we're basically going to do the exact same thing, focusing on reaching for, move your hand just a little bit up the paddle, in both hands a bit up the paddle. Then we're going to reach forward, enter and pull, and we're going to exit at our knees again. All right, so if you've done the technique before, you should find your paddling relatively straight. But if you do find, as you do this, you're starting to turn around to the left, then that means we've got to focus on some things. All right, I'm turning around this way, Callum. So, first thing I'm going to focus on is opening that paddle blade towards my board again. So here we go, like this. Or you can see I'm starting to turn to the right. And then we're going to focus on the second thing, which is the J stroke. So we'll start out wide, pull in towards the side of the board. Right now I'm really exaggerating this action. So starting really wide, pulling across the top and down the side. When you actually go to paddle up, you probably won't need to exaggerate it that much, but learning how to do it will teach you how to paddle both right and left. All right, so now we're feeling steady, we can finally get to our feet. So two ways of doing this. The way I prefer is by having both hands in the paddle already on your knees. Keep the paddle blade in the water, front foot up, back foot up. Some people find this quite tricky, so the second option is keeping your hands on the deck of the board, have your paddle across the board, blade in the water. We're going to stand up with our hands on the deck, and then as we get to our feet, we'll grab both hands at the same time. You want to always make sure as you're getting to your feet that you have your paddle blade in the water, as this will give you heaps of balance. All right, so remembering feet just wider than shoulder width, front foot square, oh, sorry. Okay, start that again. Feet just wider than shoulder width, back foot square onto the board, front foot at a 45-degree angle. And we're going to practice all the things we have tried before. So remember, leaning forward at the hips and bending slightly at the knees. I'll reach forward my paddle, drive it into the water and pull through, exiting at my feet, no further behind. Oh, I've got a jellyfish caught on my fin. All right, let's keep doing that. So forward, pull through. And you see, I'm turning to the left again. So let's fix it by doing the exact same things that we did last time. So first of all, we're going to open the paddle slightly towards our board. Immediately see it's slightly better. And then we're going to implement our J stroke. So out wide, pull towards and turn. Alright, so things to focus on here, I might not have been actually showing the best technique there, is you want to try and not stick your bum out backwards too much. So trying to keep it over centrally. Trying to keep everything centered over the top of our board so we can keep our balance. Alright, now what we're going to do is a quick practice of paddling in a circle. So I'm going to exaggerate everything I'm done and paddle to the right. Like this. So to also turn in a circle, you can slightly lean on that back foot and that'll make everything happen slightly faster. Alright, so now, you'd also notice there, I was sliding my paddle backwards. So this is not going to be good for speed. If you want to turn in a really sharp circle, Doing just that little touch at the back will help you keep spinning. All right, then we're going to paddle the other way. This should be relatively easy. Basically, if you just paddle like you probably were when you started, that'll all happen. All right, two things I want to point out with this paddle technique. First of all, getting this left hand, the top hand for me, so the top hand, getting it across the body so the paddle is straight up and down vertically. Also keeping the paddle nice and close to the side of the board. All right, now we've got all these paddle technique things sorted. Let's do a quick paddle up. So I'm using today the 1130S from Toad with a short fuse and the 142 tail. I've got an 80 centimeter mast on. I'm going to go downwind to make it slightly easier. Let's see how it goes. And we're off. Alright, so once I'm up and going, I can narrow my stance just slightly. That'll help with pumping efficiency. And we're away. Alright, so thanks for tuning in. Thanks Callum for flying the drone, and thanks Sam Grayling for coming and doing it the other day. Unfortunate the mic didn't work out for us. Other things to say, these are all general tips for everyone, but if you're wanting to get some personalized coaching, feel free to message me if you're in Perth, or if you're outside of Perth, I'll drop a link to join the Coach Casey Club with me. Thanks a heap, and we'll see you in the next one.